Donald Trump has once again attacked the BBC, saying its coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict is biased.
We speak to the former director of BBC Television, who's accused his former employer of two-tier racism.
Can you imagine if someone had posted, a BBC presenter had posted something that was that offensive about another minority community in the UK or abroad, and they left the BBC, but only after they'd had a nice sponsor and a lovely VT package saying how great they were? I think that's unimaginable. And I think that suggests there's a kind of two tiers of racism at the BBC. There's racism that the BBC is absolutely against, and then there's racism against Jews. And in that case, again, we saw that you can post something comparing Jewish people to rats, but we'll put you back on television and give you a hearty send-off and a thank you.
So, Gordon, once again, the White House has taken aim at the dear old BBC. I mean, do we think that the Donald spends a lot of time sort of like freebasing Line of Duty and getting annoyed by Fiona Bruce on Question Time?
Or even Fiona Bruce on Antiques Roadshow.
Well,
I mean, who knows?
Imagine he could bring an heirloom from his Scottish mother across. But he's sort of, again, having a go. Well, he's having a go through the medium of his press secretary, Karoline Leavitt. Now, she was asked to respond to reports that Israeli troops were firing on Gazans trying to get aid. And this is what she said in the White House briefing room.
Unlike some in the media, we don't take the word of Hamas with total truth. We like to look into it when they speak. Unlike the BBC, who had multiple headlines. They wrote, Israeli tank kills 26, Israeli tank kills 21, Israeli gunfire kills 31, Red Cross says 21 people were killed in an aid incident, and then, oh wait, they had to correct and take down their entire story, saying we reviewed the footage and couldn't find any evidence of anything. Oh. Okay, so we're going to look into reports before we confirm them from this podium or before we take action, and I suggest that journalists who actually care about truth do the same to reduce the amount of misinformation that's going around the globe on this front.
Yes, if you were watching that on the TV, you would have seen her holding up a printout of the BBC website, which she likes doing. They like a printout, don't they?
They do. It's a little bit like Donald Trump with the Cyril Ramaphosa, let me just show you these speeches and just ambush you with the information that I have at my fingertips, indeed.
They're certainly not a paperless White House.
What did the stories say, though? It was one that the BBC had reported an Israeli tank had killed 26 people, then 21 people, then gunfire killing 31.
Yeah. So the final version of that story is still on the BBC website, which says the death toll was 21. And the BBC separately published a BBC Verify report in which it said a widely circulated video believed to be captured in the aftermath of the shooting at the aid point was actually taken at a different location at a different time.
So basically Leavitt saying, look, the BBC is so bad at reporting this accurately that it's had to correct itself and correct its entire story with its own BBC Verify function. The BBC, of course, has denied all this, stood by its reporting. I'm wondering whether this is part of sort of the MAGA assault on the so-called legacy media. How many times does Elon Musk post messages on X basically suggesting that the likes of you and I, Gordon, because we're legacy media, just in case you don't know, are constantly making stuff up. What I find ironic about that is that Musk is putting up often stories that the legacy media has reported in order to suggest that someone somewhere's hiding the truth. Probably because the likes of Musk and Donald Trump would rather Joe Rogan reported all of the news in their favour. With no kind of cynicism, scepticism, or indeed critical thinking applied. No,
it's almost like they're picking and choosing, isn't it? Anyway, well, why don't we speak to Danny Cohen, who is the former director of BBC Television. He wrote a comment piece for The Telegraph saying, Trump is right, the BBC's journalism is dangerously failing.
Danny, why are you you're siding with the US president on this?
Yeah, I think we should, generally speaking, be cautious of always dismissing what the Trump administration has to say. Clearly, they're not everyone's cup of tea. Clearly, they're getting a number of things wrong. There's no doubt about that. But I think what the BBC will do is try and dismiss it, not consider it, take on an uber defensive posture in response to this because it's come from the Trump administration, rather than actually look at what they've said and see whether it has any validity. It's a sort of play the man rather than the ball approach that the BBC is taking, when actually they should maybe have a look at the ball and see whether there's any validity to the criticism.
Mm. There's been obviously quite a lot of criticism from the White House and others about BBC reporting in the last few weeks and months. We should probably just remind people that the BBC was forced to pull that now infamous documentary about Gaza and apologise for serious flaws after it turned out that the narrator was the son of a Hamas government minister. It's had the whole criticism about refusing to call Hamas terrorists. And critics of BBC Arabic say that it's biased against Israel. They've accused several of its contributors of making anti-Semitic comments both before and after the October the 7th attacks. But that aside, or taking it as a sort of slightly, as more broadly, why does the Trump administration hate the BBC so much, do you think, Danny?
I don't know, and I don't know whether they do. I'd actually prefer to talk about what the BBC is getting wrong here.
Yeah, go on then. Yeah,
do.
I mean, you're in such a unique position because it
Yeah.
must be, it's so difficult for you, Danny, because you used to work for the BBC. I know that you love aspects of the BBC, like we all do, but I do think I fall down on your side on this. And I've never been able to understand why the BBC won't call Hamas terrorists. I've never been able to understand why the BBC seems to take anything the Palestinian health authorities say as gospel. I do think, I'm sorry, I don't like journo on journo assaults, but I do think that Jeremy Bowen's reporting at times has appeared very Gaza friendly. I mean, there's also another aspect to this, Danny, in that you're Jewish. I mean, does the BBC have a problem with the reporting of Israel or Jews' involvement in a conflict in the Middle East here? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, Camilla. I mean, I think I agree about Jeremy Bowen. In fact, in my piece, and actually an extremely good piece, better than mine, that Alison Pearson's written for today's Telegraph on the BBC's reporting of the war, the Gaza war, she picks up on the Bowen point too. And the certainty he brings. He says we can only assume that Israel was responsible for firing around this food encampment. Now, the honest truth on that now is no one knows what happened as yet. It's the fog of war. One side is saying one thing, one side is saying another. But Jerry Bowen is absolutely certain it was Israel. He doesn't really have any facts to support it. He doesn't have any independent witnesses to support that. But he will go on flagship mainstream BBC programs and online and state these things as if they are facts when they're clearly not. And the relationship between that and being Jewish is, I'm afraid, very, very clear. And this is something that Alison picks up extremely well again in her piece, that misreporting of what's going on in the region, unattributed reporting, misleading headlines, bias of omission, they are creating conditions in the UK and around the world, and in America particularly, in which Jewish people are feeling less safe. And unfortunately, we're now seeing that play out with terrorist attacks on Jews in the US. And unless people begin in news organizations, and particularly the BBC, because it has such an outside impact on global information, unless they get a proper grip on that, that is going to get worse and worse, and that is extremely dangerous.
Who do you blame for this, Danny? I mean, there is a perception, isn't there, that the BBC, people who work for the BBC, have a sort of inherent sort of left-wing bias and maybe an inherent pro-Palestinian bias. I mean, individuals who work for an organisation are entitled to their own opinions, obviously. So is it the fault of the management? And if so, where should that the responsibility lie for making sure that this bias is, who's ultimately responsible?
Listen, that's the key question. And my view is that it's top down and bottom up. It's bottom up because there is structural bias in the newsroom. There's a liberal left bias in the newsroom, which plays out in a lot of its reporting, not just on Israel, but you see it reporting in the past on climate change, on the approach it's taken to the Reform Party, on Brexit, on many other things. So there is that structural bias. I think there is also anti-Israel bias in the newsroom, and we see that day in, day out in how stories are reported. But it's top down as well, because we've seen since October the 7th, 18 months now, the BBC senior leadership have not been able to get a grip on this. They've failed entirely to do so. Whether that's because they can't control the newsroom, or whether it's they just don't care enough to do so, no one will ever know. but it's a top-down and bottom-up problem. That's why I believe it's institutional. The one other thing I'd say on that, and this is a significant BBC problem, but it also arguably extends to other news outlets, is that the culture now of live update pages and social media really creates a journalistic environment in which journalists just put stuff out without checking anything about its validity, because they want to be the first, and the BBC's, does this a lot. They just want to report what someone has said. And if it's wrong, millions of people might see the initial headline as it whips around the world on social media. Thousands may see the correction. A good example is that correction you read out earlier, Camilla. And I think there is a question, and particularly with the responsibility and scale of the BBC, it should no longer be using this approach, which is report first and ask questions later, because it leads to dangerous misinformation from a genocidal terrorist group enter the mainstream of British media and global media. And that's extremely bad for journalism, extremely bad for the BBC, and it's very, very dangerous for Jewish people.
What is the situation, Danny, when it comes to whether or not reporters from across the world can or can't go into Gaza? How far can they get in? What can they see? Because a lot of the rhetoric around this, again, it's a blame Israel strategy. Well, Israel aren't letting journalists in, and therefore they cannot complain if some of the coverage that comes out is biased in favour of Gaza, Hamas, Palestinians.
Yeah, I think it's a very legitimate criticism. I think the fact that there's no journalists there is a legitimate criticism, but they're also trying to protect journalists from terrorists and the work of terrorists. And I'm not sure Israel will be thanked if it was trying to reach some hostages who were being held in a tunnel beneath a hospital, and a group of journalists got killed in the lead up to that. I don't think Israel would be on the right side of that argument either.
Although we've always had journalists on the front line, though, Danny, haven't we? I mean,
that's true. That's true.
In major world wars and beyond.
That's true, but has it been in a circumstance where there's a tunnel system larger than London Underground under an environment where terrorists are popping up all over the place with guns? I don't know. But listen, it's a legitimate point, and that's why I acknowledge it. But that doesn't give the BBC a free pass to parrot Hamas propaganda without any checks and without any context. Maybe it would have been, maybe they should have said around these things going on the food handout points, we don't actually, God forbid they might say, we don't actually know exactly what's going on there yet. There's counterclaims by either side. Until we have some verifiable facts, the BBC won't be taking a position on it.
What do you make
to me, when it's so high, it would be a responsible thing to do.
What do you make of BBC Verify, Danny? I find that quite an interesting sort of concept, that the BBC has this almost sub-brand that is kind of saying, here's what we've checked, and here's the absolute truth, and it's gospel, and that's it. I mean, does that worry you?
Listen, I think it's if it wasn't so serious, it would be a really bad joke. I watch it quite carefully. It's obsessed with Israel. I mean, it'd be an interesting study to compare how many times BBC Verify has done a report on Israel compared to what the terrible goings on in Sudan at the moment. Suffering, famine, war. It'd be really interesting to compare the levels of interest. So first of all, there's an absolute obsession with Israel. Second of all, it often doesn't verify anything. It just does a report and doesn't prove anything in what it does. And there's been a number of times where it's had to pull its content because it's not been true.
De-verify.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of pet project of the current CEO of BBC News, and I think it's become an embarrassment to the BBC. You understand there's initial impulse, data. Let's use data to try and prove stuff. Well, it's not doing a very good job of that. Maybe, and it's hard to imagine they take the time to do it, but maybe BBC Verify could do a study on the different ways in which Hamas is trying to ensure that the new process for handing out food in Gaza won't succeed, because they're clearly trying to sabotage that, because food is a weapon that they hold over the population of Gaza, that the attempts are now being made, and it's difficult to separate the population from that food supply via Hamas. So maybe they could spend some time looking into things like that, but they tend to focus on what Israel's doing and not what Hamas is doing.
Final question, Danny. We can't talk about the BBC and not talk about Gary Lineker. Were you glad to see him leave the corporation?
Yes, I was. I think Mr. Lineker's totally entitled to his views. Of course he is. Um, but I'm not sure he should be doing that as a flagship presenter on the BBC. I think it is inappropriate. I think he's been running rings around senior management at the BBC for the last year or so. And the thing he posted, which had a rat on it, which is of course a symbol that Nazis used in relation to Jews, which he reposted in relation to Zionism, was absolutely appalling. And I think it's right that he left. What I was surprised about was he was given a lovely swan song. Can you imagine if someone had posted, a BBC presenter had posted something that was that offensive about another minority community in the UK or abroad, and they left the BBC, but only after they'd had a nice swan song and a lovely VT package saying how great they were? I think that's unimaginable. And I think that suggests there's a kind of two tiers of racism at the BBC. There's racism that the BBC is absolutely against, and then there's racism against Jews. And in that case, again, we saw that you can post something comparing Jewish people to rats, but we'll put you back on television and give you a hearty send-off and a thank you.
When you consider how bungled all of this has been, I mean, should Tim Davie still be in his job? Danny?
Personally, I think it's time for change. I think, as I said, they've not been able to get a grip on any of these problems.
He keeps promising change, doesn't he?
Yeah. In fact, one of the things he promised right at the beginning was that they'd make a big stand on impartiality. And I think that that was one of his kind of key things when he got the job. And he's clearly failing on that in a very, very big way. You have to ask, in a situation where someone who, on the morning after October the 7th, supported some social media that described October the 7th as a morning of hope, and that person is still employed by the BBC at BBC Arabic, you have to ask what's happened to the BBC under his leadership.